So last year, in the aftermath of a lot of great federal action, we passed the child tax credit and an expansion of the earned income tax credit. And so we know that some tax filing information is coming into tax. We also know that there's a little bit of cleanup legislation that might make sense on some of those. And we had that great report from Pat about the earned income tax credit at the beginning of the session. I don't know if anyone remembers. It's a little big for me. Great. I'm glad you all remember it clearly. So wanted to spend some time talking about essentially sort of, who gets the child tax credit, who gets the earned income tax credit, how are Vermonters' lives improved by these things? And then if there's any sort of clean up or improvements to the statute we might want to make this year. And so with that, Abby is going to come on up if you don't mind. And Abby, we didn't talk about this, so sorry, but just if you could start with like, what is the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit briefly, that might be helpful.
Okay.
And then Abby has some draft language that are sort of some slightly technical pieces on the edge of the tax credits.
Yes. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel, there is another document under my name that is DR 230189 draft 2.2. That is some language that would amend both the child tax credit and the EITC, and it has a lot of different moving parts in it. So I'd be happy to walk you through that. But to sort of give a general overview, the child tax credit is now a Vermont tax credit that was enacted last session. It's for residents or part-year residents who can take the credit at the federal level, who are entitled to, so that have actually been granted the credit at the federal level. It's a refundable credit against Vermont income tax. It's a $1,000 credit per qualifying child as defined federally. And it's only for children who are 5 years of age or younger. And it is, so I'm just going to highlight this because part of the proposed new language does change how the credit may be paid, but it is currently, like most credits, it is paid at the time of filing. So it's a sort of a lump sum payment. I don't know if there are any questions about that, or I can give a very brief overview of the federal EITC and Vermont's EITC as well. So the earned income tax credit is a federal credit on earned income. So it applies against the personal income tax federally, and Vermont has a percentage of the amount that the individual who is filing in Vermont has been granted federally. It's currently 38% of the federal credit. And again, it has a lot of incorporation of federal law, so it sort of piggybacks on all of those federal regulations and statute that sets out who's eligible. Vermont's statute does not go into a lot of detail because it pulls in all of that federal law about eligibility. There are different calculations for the amount of earned income, different calculations for single versus for different filing statuses, but also whether individuals have a child or not. It was expanded greatly during the pandemic, but then also has also been expanded in Vermont.
And so that context is really, really important for me, because when I think about what Ted shared with us about who's receiving the earned income tax credit and maybe who should be receiving the earned income tax credit or who we want to be receiving the earned income tax credit, our leverage point is just that percentage. It's not sort of broader eligibility if we want to not cause an administrative nightmare for tax.
That has been the policy direction in the past, is to have it linked to the federal credit, and it's just a percentage. But again, I'm not really prepared, but I'm sure Pat, not to put Pat on the spot, but has more detail on how that is calculated federally, because it gets very complex very quickly based on income. There are a lot of different sort of levers. So would you like me to walk through the proposal, or is there any other
Any other big picture questions from people? Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, excellent. I will share my screen. Hopefully it works. My computer's being strange, sorry.
We can just have a follow along on our own device day.
Nope, I think that was my own ineptitude. Hey, okay, great. So it is sort of orphan language at the moment. It is not attributed to any member or the committee. It's draft language. So the first section has a couple of, each of these changes none of these look very lengthy, but there is a lot behind each of these changes. So in the child tax credit section of Vermont statute, the first change is to enable taxpayers who do not have either a social security number or what's called an ITIN, an individual taxpayer number, to be able to file in Vermont to claim the Vermont credit. So currently an individual taxpayer has to have an ITIN, so the individual taxpayer identification number, to file federally. And because Vermont doesn't have any specific provision, that flows through to Vermont. So if a taxpayer may have a social security number or an ITIN, this would enable an individual to get a Vermont specific number and still file. So that is the first change that you see starting on lines 4 through 7. The next,
This is something that I remember came up in the committee sort of a little bit after the fact. And
there was discussion last session about, does this require an individual to file a tax return in order to claim the credit? Generally, the answer is yes. So this would enable individuals who do not have a social security number and ITIN to claim the credit in Vermont. Would not require them to file federally.
Which document are we looking at?
Oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't have the EITC note, it's draft
Bottom
230189, so it's a drafting request
of- I
number.
just wasn't paying attention, that's all.
A question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
Did you just say that they're not required to file federally?
This would allow them to file in Vermont only, so,
But go ahead.
no, I'm sorry,
Didn't you say that Vermont's was based on federal?
yes, so,
Don't
yes.
have any.
Interrupting.
So how does the Vermont taxpayer, if they don't file a federal, how do they know what their federal would be
So
in order to link the two? Sorry. Go ahead.
it does have that conditional language, so, or who would have been eligible. So they can't file, they're not filing federally, they don't have a taxpayer identification number. So it could encourage them to file federally, but it wouldn't require them to have. So it's just if they would have been entitled, but for the fact they don't have this identification number, then they are entitled to this refundable credit. The department would be better placed to explain how they would administer that. But my guess at how that would work is they would have some sort of pro forma, so like a special schedule that would calculate how
I see.
and the department's coming in later.
they should really speak to.
I see.
My question might be for them as well, so feel free to let me know. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how does one without a social security number or an ID number file taxes in Vermont?
The ITIN is a number. Sorry.
Right,
That's the federal number that you,
correct. And so I think what I am reading here is if you don't have that number,
and you
you
could,
can still get the credit. So like by filing your taxes in Vermont without a number or a social security number.
so that would also likely require the department to create either a new numbering system. I think they would have to speak to how that would be implemented, but very pertinent question.
And Carol, I remember you bringing this up a few times last year as something that was important to you and to your community.
To probably people around Vermont who need help and
I'm wondering how likely they are to file. They're already not filing.
I think both Craig and Joint Fiscal can talk about, and actually I imagine Public Assets as well. The fiscal estimate for this is quite low.
Might want to call it de minimis.
No, I think the vote, anyway, yeah. But let's get through the legal language first.
She just wanted to say that.
Yeah, bingo. The next change is relating to taxpayer identification number requirements for the child. So under current statute federally, which is incorporated in this language, the qualifying child has to have a taxpayer identification number. This notwithstands that. So it also applies the child doesn't have to have identification numbers to be claimed. That is the change to existing statute. I do want to point out on line 13, there's this 13 through 16 in the child tax credit statute has this sort of phase out of the amount of the credit based on the taxpayer's income that's received while they're not a Vermont resident. And I'm pointing that out because that was a technical request by the department to line up the EITC and the child independent care credit with this language. The House did pass out in miscellaneous tax bill that technical change to the child independent care credit. Further down in this proposed language, it makes the same sort of technical alignment in the earned income tax credit. Before getting to that, there is a section 2, which is split out. It's again amending the child tax credit statute. It's adding a new subsection D. And the reason that this is split out is because it has a contingent effective date. So it's not within that first section. It's split out to make it clear that this would apply at a different point in time. When the child tax credit was initially proposed, when it was introduced in the House last year, it had a provision to make advance payments. So the federal child tax credit at the federal level, so not in Vermont, would have advance monthly payments for a short period of time. It did sunset. This would create a similar but not identical provision for making advance payments. It would be quarterly payments of the credit during the calendar year that would equal half of the annual amount of the credit. They would be made in equal amounts, and the commissioner would be able to modify that amount if they have any information that shows that the individual's not, so eligibility information. So the commissioner has authority to adjust the amounts. And then at the time of filing, the individual will be able to claim the remaining 50%. So that would be sort of a safeguard against any fluctuations in their income or any, any other information like the child aging out, for example. That would be trued up at the time of filing.
And Abby, is there a sort of a complicated effective date mechanism later down in the bill?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a contingent effective date. This is not taking effect immediately. And I'll get to that and I'll actually skip ahead and then go back to the EITC because that's the way this works. And then there is another subdivision that makes it clear that individuals may opt out of advance payments, and that may be for any types of reason, any reason that perhaps their income is fluctuating or they know their child is aging out. So they don't want to be getting advance payments and having to pay them back.
Representative Anthony?
Maybe this is a Commissioner Bolio question, but why would the advance payment be limited to such a half? It seems to me kind of small. I mean, you could true up in the last quarter if you did quarterly. It's just a lot to hold back. The whole point is to avoid the cash flow crunch on a family that's not well off. I'm just surprised.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking on whether the federal advance payments were also half. That may have been the model.
Really? Okay. So monthly, they were half.
They were monthly, but half of
half,
the amount.
okay.
I think that's why it was modeled on that.
Yeah, it was modeled on that. That is,
Okay, thank you.
yes, that is also my memory. Representative Odie?
I'm concerned about what you said. If a person forgot to opt out, they got too many payments, they don't want to have to pay them back. I hate to put the burden on people to figure this out. I mean, I'm confused listening to it. You're quarterly and blah, blah, blah. So what could we do to make it not on them to figure this out? Wouldn't they just kind of enter the birthdays of the children and then put it on the tax department to figure out when to pay and not pay?
This would mostly fall on the tax department. It does require them to establish a program to make the advance payments. It's not, it doesn't, the federal, the way the IRS administered the advance payments was to set up a whole online structure. And then I know they also had, taxpayer information sessions, clinics where people could go to sign up. So it doesn't require that level of administration, but you'd want to hear from them about how they would actually implement all of this. But it would put most of the burden on the department to create this structure and make the payments, and those sort of detailed determinations would be made by the department.
And we can ask Craig more about this last year when we had the conversation. There was a conversation about people sort of opt in the first year and then are sort of included for future years. That's or being part of the effective date stuff. Yes.
Yeah, Carol, notwithstanding the complications that we're discussing right now, the discussion last year downstairs was to figure out how to get to the money to the families who need it as timely as we could.
Yeah.
We didn't have time last year to figure that out.
So I will scroll ahead to the effective dates because I want to say the reason, but one of the considerations last session that ended up in this advance payment being removed from the bill was its effect on other benefit programs. So there's a huge variety of treatment in different federal and state, but mainly federal benefit programs that treat state tax credits as income when determining if an individual is eligible for a benefit and how much they're eligible for. So doing advance payments rather than one lump sum could include this as income. So it would effectively reduce benefits for individuals who would be otherwise eligible for the credit and for benefits. So there's very lengthy and complicated effective date language here, making that advance payment provision contingent on, so it takes effect either on the later of July 1st or, so that's not likely to happen, the first day of the second quarter of the state fiscal year after there is a federal change to benefit programs to make it clear that state tax credits that are paid in advance would not be included in income. So there's a lot of, there's a list of different programs, particularly SNAP. So that's 3 Squares in Vermont. And those are the rules that were concerning to this body last session because it would have included monthly or quarterly payments in individuals' benefit determinations.
And Public Assets can share a little more about this, but there are folks all over the country who pass child tax credits after states who pass child tax credits after we did that are sort of working to get these federal rules clarified. And Abby, am I right? We use sort of a similar mechanism for Wayfair, basically. We passed the bill and we said once the feds do this thing, then it becomes law. Okay.
Yes, so this actually, based on that experience, pushed out the implementation a bit further because just the way that the fiscal year quarters and the Wayfair decision, it ended up only being about a week between the start of the next fiscal year and that decision. So it was bit of a crunch administratively. So this makes it, this was a bit of a surprise. So this gives a bit more time to roll this out and to make the monthly payments or quarterly payments, kick in. So there's a lot of language here, but that's the gist of it. So any federal action, so either federal legislation, a decision by controlling court, so Supreme Court or appeals court that is jurisdiction over Vermont, or if there is, that's unlikely, but if there were any way there was some sort of administrative action that could change the federal rules, and most of it's in statute, but if that were to occur federally, then Vermont's provision would kick in. So there would be advanced quarterly payments of the child tax credit. So there's a list here, but it's not exhaustive. Even while drafting this, there were some changes and interpretations federally of some housing programs, whether or not they would count state tax credit as income or not. So this is, it's drafted to be as comprehensive as possible. I'm gonna scroll back up. So those are the changes to the child tax credit. And section 3 makes some changes to the earned income tax.
And this is, I want to give a caveat for you, Abby, because this is basically just a template to change statute if we decide we want to change the percentages based on what we heard at the beginning of the session.
Yes, so I will start actually with this sort of easier change here. That's more of a technical change on lines 18 and 20. This is what I showed you in the child tax credit, the phase out based on individuals' income earned or received during their period of residency. So that would align the earned income tax credit phase out to the child tax credit and to what the House passed out in the technical administrative bill to the child independent care credit. So that's the sort of most technical change that's happening here. The bigger structural change that's proposed is on lines 15 and 16, and it interacts with all the new language you see starting on line 20. So the credit would still be piggybacking off of federal definitions and credits. But rather than being a set percentage for any claimant, right now it's 38%. Instead, it would be a percentage as determined in these new subdivisions that are being added. So it's starting on line 20, the percentage of the EITC that's granted under federal law will be in Vermont based on their filing status. And for now, there is only placeholder language here. This particular construct is that an individual who is married filing jointly or married filing separately would have a certain percentage, and then individuals whose filing status is single, head of household, or surviving spouse would have a different percentage. And then that would be effective retroactively to the start of this taxable year. So 2023, it will be available starting next filing season in 2024.
Okay. Thanks. Pat, I'm thinking it might make sense to skip you for now.
A couple of short comments or?
Okay, yes, please come make a couple short comments and let's not dive too far into the EITC. I just want to make sure we have enough time for the commissioner and public assets.
No, I'm just gonna confirm that with the expansion for the new eligibility, I wouldn't change our estimate that we've already provided. I think that the amount of people we're talking about is still would be within the margin of error.
So for the child tax credit, you would consider these changes de minimis?
Yes.
You got that, Representative Andrews?
I'm sorry, no. Minimus. Great.
The comment was based on the change for the amount of people this would pull in. I don't think I would change the estimate we've already provided. I think it would still fall within the margin of error.
Okay.
Thanks. Not voting on anything.
No, I just.
That's all. Talk about the EITC later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's really fun to be put on the spot. Sorry about that.
No, that was my bad.
And then I pulled you off and now Craig's not here yet. So Steph, let's start with you, if that works for you. Okay, great.
I'm gonna join the Zoom meeting so I can share slides. So let me see if I'm getting my voice in stereo or not. Hi. So good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thanks for having me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephanie Yu. I'm the Executive Director of Public Assets Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank in Montpelier, established in 2003. And our mission is to improve the well-being of all Vermonters and advance racial, social, and economic justice through research, fiscal analysis, and public engagement. So I do have a couple of slides which I can share just if anybody's watching, but oops, the stereo. So I just want to sort of set this up as like how we think about these tools. So as policymakers, you're deploying a lot of tools to make sure that families can meet their basic needs. And we really think of them in two buckets. One that's really addressing the cost side of things, and makes the cost of major expenses cheaper for people. So, and then the second bucket is really addressing the income side, getting more money to families. And there's sort of a mix of these things in the policy that we have. So on the cost side, some examples of those programs are things like housing subsidies, 3 Squares Vermont, healthcare subsidies, childcare assistance, all those things that are for a specific cost to make that cost more affordable to families. But then on the income side, we have some minimum wage policy, we have Reach Up, which is, cash assistance to families. And then we have the EITC and the child tax credit, among some other things. But I think it's just helpful to think of those two pieces as sort of working on different sides of the family budget equation, right? And so, and a lot of the reason that we have all these different tools is because not all families need the same supports, but they all need some flexibility because these things change over time, right? Those needs change over time. They might change because their kids are aging or whatever's happening, or they might change all of a sudden, as we saw for many families during the pandemic. But even with all of these tools, to kind of put this in context, even with all of these tools, many Vermont families are still struggling to meet their basic needs. There's still a lot of gaps for families. So I think giving them more flexibility on the income side makes a lot of sense. And I think these gaps exist still in part because we didn't have a good map of the gaps necessarily when these policies were designed, or they weren't designed to fill all the gaps, and in part because they're just not sort of keeping up with changing costs as those happen. So whether that's inflation or whether that's the housing market or sort of all these moving pieces in a family budget. But the good news is that federal child tax credit expansion gave us a lot of good information about how people use these child tax credits and the effects that they had, right? So that was sort of this real time experiment of what this might look like, which is why I think a lot of states followed suit in creating their own state child tax credits, seeing sort of the effect of this federal version on families' finances and their budgets. So, and that expansion, I think, probably you've heard this before, but just kind of a quick recap, that expansion, it was bigger than the sort of baseline federal child tax credit. It was made fully refundable, meaning that even if you had no income, you would get the full value of the credit. And it covered more kids. And it was also this periodic payment. It provided these monthly payments so we could sort of see how it worked when it was going over time as opposed to the sort of 1 month sum at tax time, right? So the two most important things that federal child tax credit expansion made clear were that refundable child tax credits clearly lift kids out of poverty. So most dramatic decline across the country in poverty that we've ever seen, including a 2-point drop here in Vermont, which translates to 4,000 Vermont kids being pulled above the poverty line and another 4,000 at least being lifted closer to the poverty line, right? So just improving the family finances for 8,000 Vermont kids. And then the second piece is what parents and caregivers spent the money on. They spend it on their basic needs. So if you look, this is all sort of national data, but the kind of informal surveys in Vermont sort of support the idea that the profile is pretty similar in Vermont, which is that food was the #1 expenditure that people spent this money on. And keep in mind that the federal tax credit was quite a bit more. So it was $3,000 for kids. I think it was the same split, 6 and over and 3,600 for kids under 6, right? So food's the #1. And that is true across income levels, up to 150,000 in household income. Food was still the #1 thing that people spent the money on. And then essential bills, clothing, housing, and either school expenses or paying down debt were the round out that sort of top 5 of what people were spending the money on. And again, that's up to incomes of 150,000. Once you get sort of above that, it's a little bit of a slightly different mix, but still essential needs are at the top of that list. Right? Those are sort of the two big things that became really clear with this kind of real-time experiment.
Where's that list that you just went through?
It's not in I'm happy to send you the documentation on that. I didn't send that chart because it's not our chart, but there is some really good research on this and I'm happy to send the links around.
I would love that.
And that's very similar to sort of analysis of the effects of the earned income tax credit. We do have kind of a, a long history with the earned income tax credit as well. It shapes out pretty well. There was a little bit of an expansion with the EITC, with the federal EITC during COVID, but it wasn't sort of quite as big a leap. But we see that same pattern, right? That it lifted many people out of poverty and that people are spending the money on basic needs. So even though it's a slightly different but overlapping population, and it's designed differently, different incentives, we also see the same pattern, lifting people out of poverty and spending money on basic needs. So putting these two credits together, I think, add up to a really effective way to fight poverty and what it looked like across the country, as we're talking 10 million people lifted out of poverty by the combination of these things. And then here's where I do have some charts, so I can share my screen here. But I think it's even more critical, these credits are even more critical in Vermont. And the reason for that is because we have a bit of a wage problem in Vermont. You may have seen this slide before. We update it every year and it keeps looking the same, right? So the problem still is the same. Can you see all that? Is that working? Okay. So prices average in Vermont. This is all relative to the US average. That black line is the US average. Prices pretty average, wages pretty low. So, and actually ticked down a little bit over the pandemic, right? Relative to the US average, meaning that wages in Vermont were growing more slowly than in the country as a whole. And then the second piece that we really wanted to look at is to really understand what was happening with families' basic needs. So again, this is a chart we've looked at before, but updated for sort of post-pandemic numbers, right? So what you see there is this is the basic needs budget line. The lower line is for a single parent with one child, so that child would be in childcare. And the higher line is for a family of four, one earner, so no children in paid care, no childcare costs, and still at the Vermont average wage, not able to meet their basic needs, right? So, and the average wage is actually above the median, right? So something like between about 60% of Vermonters are making below the average wage. So that's a whole lot of families that are affected by that. And of course, the minimum wage is lower. And at that minimum wage, they're going to qualify for a lot of subsidies. For 100% of the childcare subsidies, they'd qualify for some other benefits, but still there's these gaps that persist even with all of that.
Do we have a slide of that? Dare I ask when you have one or maybe two children in paid care?
So it does go up. It does go up quite a bit. That's right. So even with so if you have two earners, right, making the average wage, you might make it. But if you have one parent earning the average wage and the other earning the minimum wage, you're not getting there with two children in paid care. But there's all these different family types. I think the larger point is that there's this whole mix of what families' finances look like. Some use paid care, some don't. Some need housing support, some don't. Some need more food assistance than others. And even with all of those sort of pieces, there's still these big gaps in meeting basic needs, made evidenced by what people spent their federal child tax credit on. Yeah.
Stephanie, intuitively, a significant contributor is the gender wage gap. And I'm curious, and again, this may be on the fly, whether this would still be true even if women did not receive only 85 cents per dollar of male wages, or whether that would essentially bring the average wage itself up closer to basic needs.
So I think there's sort of a couple pieces of that question that we could break down. We haven't done a specific analysis on that, but I think this sort of speaks to that kind of original bucket that I was talking about, which is the income side. Clearly there's a wage problem. Some of that wage problem does result in this wage gap. So if you do something about wages, I think you solve some of that problem. I think, you certainly see that the majority of single parent households are headed by women. So there's certainly some relevance in sort of the where the kids are. But, I'd have to think about that too. And I think there's also this question of how you get to the wage gap. I think that question has been asked, and I'm not sure there's really sort of a lot of good suggestions about how you do that, because a lot of
medical leave is actually one of the
right.
most proven methods for getting at the gender wage gap.
part of the challenge is that it's, you know, that also there's a lot of professions that tend to be dominated by one gender or another. And, you know, yes, but family and medical leave is certainly one of those pieces. I think addressing all these sort of basic needs does get to that. You know, and I think that's another thing that a lot of the research around the child tax credit has addressed, which is, and I think if you read sort of the reach up studies of sort of how people leaving reach up, not leaving reach up, one of the major barriers is the cost of transportation for work, right? So some of these pieces, I think that address that also speak to how you kind of fill those gaps for people and speak to the need for the maximum flexibility in those gaps because of the sort of different circumstances that people are facing.
Go ahead.
Couple of questions. How do you know what a family spent their extra income on?
There were pretty extensive surveys done sort of tracking this the federal expansion of the child tax credit. So this is all.
What bothers me, I mean, I received some extra income because of of COVID. And it just goes into the pot. Mm-hmm. And somebody says, well, what did you spend it on? I don't know what I spent it on.
Yeah.
And if somebody said, well, it's your child tax credit, what do you think you spend it on? Well, then I would say, I spent it on food as opposed to I spent it on a new snowmobile. So how do you parse that and figure out what actually?
I think, I want you to have a chance to answer the question, but I think Representative Andrews offered something that when you have less money, you are more aware of what you are spending your money on to represent. Stephanie, do you want to answer sort of more technically though?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that's right. And I think there's also, this is surveys across the board. So it's not just, you know, a handful of individuals, but we're sort of adding up. And so what people listed was, they captured all of the things that people listed. So it wasn't just that you asked them, what did you spend most of it on? It was you asked all of the categories that you spent it on. And the things that rise to the top are these. So the most people said they spend it on food. Most people said they spend it on essential bills. So, you know, more than half of people are saying, so this is sort of the top things that people cite. So there might be a whole list. But these were the ones that were the most common.
Okay. The other question I've always had is when you said it raised people out of poverty, how much of that is just because they got more income and therefore came above the poverty level, and how much is because it actually helped the family to make more money? Is there a way to separate those two?
That's a good question. So I think there is some work on that. I don't know that we have a lot of good numbers. So so there has been some really good research. And again, I'm happy to send links around, but on the sort of employment effects of the child tax credit, and did it actually help people get to work? And, you know, or did it have a negligible effect? Did it have a positive effect? Did it have a negative effect on whether people worked more or less? And there is some good research like showing that for a lot of parents, when they got these periodic payments, they actually worked more, right? Yeah. So it contributes to that. But to answer the sort of technical question, I think that you're asking on how these numbers are determined, it is just now we're over the poverty line. We were under the poverty line before. So if you're right around that, and that $3,000 made a difference, or the combination of the $3,000 from the child tax credit plus the expansion of the earned income tax credit put you over the line. The analysis is very clear that it's sort of separating out each piece. So just the child tax credit by itself had this effect on this many families. Just the EITC by itself had this effect. And again, happy to send all these.
That'd be good. Thanks. Okay.
That would be helpful if you could send us that data. Send it to the whole committee, please. So it's always bothered me that women or fathers who decide to stay home and are the stay-at-home parent get no credit tax-wise or in any other way for the value of their contributions, which is significant. And I have other years submitted a bill, I didn't do it this year, but to give some kind of a tax credit equal to these families, equal to the amount of money they would have gotten with this income level wherever they are at for childcare. And it never goes anywhere. But is that stay-at-home parent affected in any way by this, the EITC?
I think you're raising a really important issue of how we value sort of unpaid labor, right? And how we talk about unpaid labor and how that shows up in the economy, both sort of officially valued, but also sort of sort of culturally, how is that valued and what does our public policy reflect? So, you know, again, I think that is what's helpful about a lot of our basic needs policy and our sort of breakout of these things is that we are looking at different family types. So we are looking at, in this case, like what does it look like for one earner? What does it look like if you have your kids in paid care or not in paid care? And, you know, that could be a mix of all kinds of different family types, right? There could be grandparent care, there could be neighbor care, you know, whatever that might look like, whether your kids are in paid care or not. But I think, so I think these are really good questions. I think it also gets to sort of why has unpaid labor historically been undervalued? There's this gender component to it, absolutely, right? So I think there's sort of a lot of pieces that that kind of go into this mix of what does it mean for families to meet their basic needs? What does it mean for families to have flexibility to make these choices, and how do we value those choices? So, you know, I think it's part of the big mix. I don't know that I've ever seen any particular analysis of sort of your bill or the tax, like a specific tax credit, how you would estimate what that would look like. But I think acknowledging, like part of the sort of goal of the child tax credit is to acknowledge that kids are expensive and you can't always predict in what ways, right? Having kids is a collective good, right? That we want to invest in. That's why we do public education for K-12. That's why we invest in childcare. That's why we invest in kids, right? Because we see that as a public responsibility.
Can you go to the next slide? Because I think it's helpful backdrop to what you're saying now.
If I can get back to that. So, and this is this is one we also sort of try to update every year, and I think this gives us the sense. It's not exactly the split because it's under 5 instead of under 6, but it gives you the sense of you really see higher poverty rates for families with young children particularly.
Regardless of their costs.
Regardless of their costs. And I think part of that has to do with sort of the big shock that you go from not having kids to having kids. That's sort of a major financial shock, right? Like that's sort of the biggest, and you're also relatively early in your career. So that sort of tends to be your lower earning period. So, you know, that as you're getting older, potentially you're earning more. Less true for low wage workers, but still true sort of overall in the arc, right, of your earning potential. And then, I mean, what's interesting here is that you also see that families with both children under 5 and 5 to 17 have an even higher poverty rate, which sort of implies that maybe our poverty thresholds aren't the best for estimating family size, which I think everybody sort of appreciates the fact that the poverty thresholds are a guideline. They're not really a good message. They're not really a good measure of whether families are struggling or not. It doesn't capture all sort of that picture. They're kind of, they're sort of an archaic measurement, which is why we've worked with both the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure to kind of triangulate what's true. Jumped around a little bit there at the end, and I'm happy to answer other questions, but I think there is this case. We do see these gaps. We saw how effective the federal expansion was, and sort of providing that flexibility to families who need it, and sort of looking at what's the right mix of the tools in the cost bucket, the specialized tools sort of in the cost bucket, and the more flexible tools that are in the income bucket.
And then the little tweaks that little is sort of relative, but the tweaks that we were talking about making to the child tax credit, do you have any thoughts on that, the expansion?
So I think part of the, again, sort of in this research on the periodic payments, I think it's useful. I also understand sort of the federal constraints, but it definitely makes sense sort of from the family budgeting perspective to go to the periodic payments. I think part of the interest in the EITC expansion. So there's a couple of different sort of weird pockets of groups of people that don't get covered by some of these pieces, both in sort of on the CTC front and on the EITC front. So I think this sort of takes some steps in that direction of covering some of those people, even though there might not be that many people in this category of not having a social security number and ITIN on the CTC side. On the EITC side, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is that the single piece, so I think you've probably seen a lot of the descriptions of the EITC are this trapezoid, right? Where it goes up as you earn more, then it sort of plateaus and you get the maximum for a while and then it sort of phases out over time. But it's still pretty low for single people. So it's a good amount of money for families with children, but it's pretty low for single people. And we are seeing sort of more of those single households in Vermont. So what does that look like? So how do we make that piece, that end of it a little bit more robust? And also the individual piece doesn't start at 18. It starts at 25. So there's also sort of a couple of different groups that just sort of are left out, and over 65 too, on the single side of things. So there's a couple of pockets. I think these are good steps to kind of start to cover some of those missed pockets.
You said a pocket is 18 to 25 years old?
If you're single and between 18 and 24, you're not covered. Again, these are the federal pieces that flow through. So that's not a Vermont decision, but it was one of the pieces that they looked at expanding during COVID to kind of cover that piece, recognizing. But because it's a relatively modest amount at the federal level, when it's a percentage at the state level, it's also pretty small.
Children who had been in foster care treated any differently?
It's a good question. One of the pieces we were looking at with the EITC expansion was emancipated minors. I don't know that we looked specifically at foster care, but that'd be a good question. I know that we would make the case for emancipated minors to qualify for an EITC if they were earning money, that they would fall into that category. I don't know about foster care more broadly.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I think everyone's excited about the extra documents.
I will send those around.
Thanks. Commissioner Bolio. Thanks for coming next door to see us.
Thanks for having me. Long time no see. Okay, I'm talking about EITC and child tax credit today.
Yeah, I love if we could start with sort of the big picture and then talk about details after that, if you don't.
Sure, big picture meaning.
You sent this really cool summary.
Fair enough. That counts as big picture, sure. For the record, Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner.
And you can take a breath and all those things.
Yeah, well, and I'm happy to start with the chart. My apologies, I sent it very, very late, and Sorcia is always right on top of it, so thank you for that. This is something we put together through processing on March 21st, so it's a few days old now, but I think it still shows some interesting data. So, right, the child tax credit was created as part of the tax reduction package last year in Act 138. It was anticipated to be $31.8 million, I believe, for relief for Vermont taxpayers. What's really interesting about it right now, and we have about half of the returns that I would anticipate us getting through the tax season, seem to be right at about half of that number. And what was really interesting about this chart, from my eyes, was showing how much of that money is being concentrated among the lowest income Vermonters, right? So this is based on federal poverty level, which is of course based on household size and not just income, but you can see really the majority, not the majority actually, but a large chunk of the money is going to those at or under 150% of federal poverty level.
In the sort of halfway through the tax filing, halfway through the tax filers, I guess, not halfway through the tax filing season, do lower income folks tend to file earlier?
Yes.
I know that I filed earlier when I was lower income personally.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll have to see how this shakes out, but you're absolutely correct. Most of the time we see the refund returns, the lower income returns coming in earlier in the season, often even as early as, February, March. And then you start to see more of the extended, the paid filers later in the year.
Sorry, back to the chart. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm happy to take any questions on this, but I just thought it was really interesting to show the breakdown of where it's gone. I'm also, again, proud that we've processed $16 million of that. We set our most ambitious refunding goals ever last year that we met. And I'm happy to report that, again, we're in the middle of it all, but we continue to meet or exceed the pace of last year week by week. So we are, again, hopeful to issue 95% of refunds by June 1st. I have every confidence that we're going to do that. So we're in good shape over at the tax department. I don't have it on this chart, but I did grab the number before I came over. For earned income tax credit, we have issued payments to 13,000 taxpayers. And that is a total of $12 million so far at this point in the year. That is usually about a $30 million tax expenditure on an annual basis. I don't know how that stacks up to prior years, but sorry, was that your question, Madam Chair?
No, it was actually, I noticed there's also 13,000 returns on the CPC, and I wondered about the overlap between the.
I think there's a big Venn diagram there. I mean, you got to recognize EITC has a lower income ceiling than the child tax credit. But yeah, so it's not exactly the same, but I do think there's probably a bit of overlap there. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head though. So looking at the draft that was posted for child tax credit and earned income tax credit changes. I think on page 1, am I reading it correctly that it's trying to clarify that that it's available for those with tax identification numbers and not just social security numbers, the child tax credit? Am I reading that right?
That's how yes.
For whatever it's worth, that's already our interpretation of tax. So yeah, happy to take the clarification, but yeah, that's fine with us. I testified before, right? A prepayment of child tax credit payments is no small feat for us. It would be definitely a change in process. I think it would take some resources. There are some questions about people who move. So recognizing that section is contingent upon federal law changes. My concerns that I had before on what that would take remain. But I also recognize it's not creating that to happen immediately. But I would ask the committee to be thoughtful, and I could come back with some of those questions and things that need to be worked through. That I do just want to recognize it's not necessarily an easy switch to flip. It takes a lot of work, and I think that there will be not just administrative elements for the department, but also like taxpayers who get caught up in something that they might not recognize is happening and hurt them in a way if they move or something like that.
Representative Odie flagged some of that before you got here, Representative.
I was among the folks who were kind of surprised and then realized that probably the 50% payout cascaded from the federal rather than making any intuitive sense. And I was among the folks who said, gee, if you're really cash strapped, why would Vermont hold back as much as half? But I really don't want to make the administrative burden even more onerous because there would have to be a true up sooner or later.
Yeah. So
anyway,
my worry on a full prepayment is maybe less about like the programming elements of that. I don't think that piece is a huge difference between 50% or 100%. I think part of the reason, I'm speculating a little bit, I think part of the reason the feds did that as well is that true up and the cost to those people who ended up getting that prepaid and then not eligible for it at the end of the year, right? That the impact of that is more significant if you've prepaid the entire amount. I also, right, again, the moving is the one I focus on, right? But somebody who lived here and then moves out of state, it's going to be really hard to get that money back. And so if you've paid all of it in a prepayment, again, that just gets that much harder to actually get that money back if they're not eligible the next year in a way that's different from a federal program, right? Where it doesn't really matter what state you live in.
I was thinking about quarterly and then the last quarter is a true up.
Yeah.
Not to make your job any more, because intuitively I realize that that's a gamble.
Yeah, admittedly, I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it since last year, so I'd want some more time. But yeah, just those kind of considerations that I'm happy to come back and work through.
Representative Andrews and Sims.
Thank you for this. I was just sitting here trying to contemplate what the easiest path forward would be. I'm sure you've done that more than I have, but I was thinking about making bank deposits to an account versus mailing checks, and also then appreciating that not everyone's going to have a bank account. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, we never want to mail checks if we can do a direct deposit. The vast majority of our refunds today are direct deposit. I don't have a percentage off the top of my head, but overwhelming majority. That is where my head, we would not want to send quarterly checks to everybody who qualifies for this, right? Because I think it's going to be like 30,000 taxpayers. But I mean, that's also a challenge, right? Like if they switch banks mid-year, something like that, right? We get the bank account from the return today and we use that to send the money, right? The moment you start getting further away from those dates and doing things either before the fact or after the fact, you run into those kind of challenges that you have to address. But yeah, certainly our preference would be a bank account, but if you don't have one or for whatever reason you want a check, we'll mail you one.
And assuming you had one child, that would be $1,000 annual credit. So 50% of that is $500 divided by 4 is $125 a quarter. Is that right?
I think that math checks out, yes.
Providing people. It would be very helpful for me to understand what the costs of setting up that system for your department would be for.
Yeah, and
at least for some meaningful, but also pretty modest if we're talking about half of it.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I don't have all the like dollar figures with me today, but my testimony last year was like, hey, let's not prepay it right now, right? Like it's still impactful. It's still going to help folks. I agree that there's maybe a question about the cost benefit if the amounts are that modest for what the costs are. We have never done something like that at my department before to do something, right? We don't have like quarterly payments going out from our system. We could do it, right? We're capable of doing that. We have a very powerful system and we have a great workforce, but it would be new. So there would be things that we haven't considered yet as we go through programming that. I think it creates a different seasonality to our work as well, right? Like we can predict today that around this time, our phone call volume goes up, right? And we prep for that. We move folks from one section to another. We hire seasonal temps, right? If you start to have that kind of thing where, again, people have changed bank accounts, people have moved, they didn't get their check, right? You're going to start to have more of a quarterly impact to that. That I think we would have to be thoughtful about too. So there are some elements there, and it's not that I'm unaware of why there's attractiveness to doing the prepayments. It's just, the reality of pulling that off can be challenging. And you saw the challenges that the IRS has experienced with trying to do those kind of things.
And then on the EITC,
yes,
I know that you're interested in increasing it overall. We got this great report from JFO at the beginning of the session about sort of who was benefiting from the EITC and who might not be as much as we might think that they should be. And so if we know that a lot of other states have different percentages for different categories, and I wondered just if that's something that you've given any thought to in order to shift impact around.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Madam Chair, I know like Minnesota, for instance, has a higher percentage. I know other states do. I don't know if I can cite them all off the top of my head, but the administration's position on that is a yes and, right? So if you want to talk about increasing the percentage specifically for those who are filing single head of household or surviving spouse versus married filing joint, married filing separately, we're open to that. But we also want to make sure that there is a broad-based increase to the percentage. I guess how I've usually seen it split out is those with children or dependents and those not, and that is not how it's split out here. And I didn't know if that, I don't fully know what the reason is for that split, or if
we're just planning
to change. Okay,
great.
Right, because the program scales up quickly if you have children, right? So I've seen most of the states I've seen do it between that split. Again, the administration would be open to that, but we would want to fill in 45% for those with children section, and then open to talking about what the committee is looking to do for those without children. Or if there's another split, I would need more time to think about that and those impacts, but I think we're open to having that conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about earned income tax credit. I mean, it's a great program, right? Like it's one of the most widely recognized, most successful anti-poverty programs. Advocates talk about not just the fiscal impact, but right, like health and on children, about like the impacts of those families having that money. So something that the governor and administration is very interested in talking about.
And then Pat mentioned something to me in passing that I'm curious about, which is that it's that families who have heads of household don't necessarily file as head of household.
Interesting. I'd have to
Okay.
look into that
It
more.
was just in passing this morning. I'm not like trying to trap you. It was just.
No, I appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things we were discussing before you came in the room, we thought this was best suited for you, is that if there is a person that doesn't have a social or a tax ID number, so they're not filing federally, could they still file in Vermont to receive the credit, and what would that look like for your department?
They can. It probably takes more work for us to process than if they filed federally, because we use a lot of the data that we get. So today, if you file electronically, that goes through a system at the IRS called the Modernized E-Filing System. And so it starts at the IRS, and you usually get that email from your software vendor that says the feds have accepted your return. And then a couple hours later, you get the Vermont has accepted your return. That's because the feds take that whole package, federal return and state return, and they send it to the state that has the state returns attached. And then we get access to both of those pieces in our system. So we do use just the presence of a federal return and then the data from that federal return to do a lot of our verification steps. So it would take more work probably for a human being to review those returns, to take those steps. So our preference is always to get those together. But again, recognizing that not everybody is required to file a federal return or able to file a federal return, or we just get some separately sometimes, especially like when we get a paper return, we can work through that.
And you can manage that process without having a number associated with that human.
So if somebody does not have, most have TINs if they don't have a social, but if they have nothing, we call it a pseudo social security number in our system, but we generate a Vermont specific number for them because we want to be able to make sure that if they come back next year, that we have an account for them and can find that history. So we'll generate a number for them and then assign that to them in our system and process it as if that was the TIN or the social security number that they had.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thoughts, questions?
Commissioner, I'm impressed how willing you are to try to accommodate people who could use the resources here, and I hope that we can keep the administrative burden down to a dull more. There's a lot of fussiness in what we're talking about here, and it, I'm just my comments over here on the side.
So I appreciate both sides of that comment, both understanding that, I mean, this is something that matters a lot to me, right? We talked about our core values at the start of the legislative session, right? And service is the first one of those, right? And so for me, it's all about like, how do we make it as easy as possible to fulfill both your responsibilities and your opportunities within the Vermont tax system, right? And so this fits squarely into that. I have also really appreciated all the time that I've been in this role at the department that this committee has been very much a partnership on that front, right? Of like understanding what we can do. We're able to have open and transparent and friendly conversations about what is possible. And the committee has adjusted things in the past when I've been like, I can't do that, right? And so I've been very appreciative of those discussions, happy to continue those and thank you for the perspective.
Can you share with us the names of the vendors, electronic vendors who are currently fairly accurate?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me, so we have a lot of vendors that get approved every year. And I don't know that, I think it's like dozens, right, that get approved every year.
Brand new ones. Brand new vendors.
No. I mean, most of them are year over year,
Oh, okay.
getting approved. And we have a list on our website. So our testing process is this. We ensure that they will generate the files that can be processed by us. And we do some checking of accuracy as well. But I have to be honest, like we would not have the ability to check every software vendor, everything that they're doing, right? And those, they update as well throughout the season. So I'm not in a position to even be able to answer that question. But I will say, electronic filing overall, you are much, much, much less likely to make an error. right? Because all of these vendors are working really hard to ensure accuracy. When we find things that are not accurate, we have a team that is working quickly with them, and they are generally responsive to those kind of things. We do sometimes have some struggles being a small state, but those are mostly with nice to have features and not, hey, the software is wrong right now or calculating something wrong. They're very responsive to those things. So overall, I would say e-filing, you're much more likely to get an accurate return, much less likely to make like a math error or miss something that you might be entitled to, right? But unfortunately, I'm not in a position to start naming vendors who's the best and who's not. But we do have a list.
There's a list on the.
There's a list on our website of everybody who is approved for filing in Vermont. So that means that we have gone through the certification process with them to make sure that they're generating the forms correctly, they're generating the schedules correctly, and that they passed our round of testing that usually happens every winter.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us today. Appreciate it. So we are done for the morning. We're going to be back here after the floor to talk about services and then joining that CTE meeting.